great to be with you. And in around 2009, my good friend Warren Bird at Leadership Network called me and said, Jim, are you seeing a lot of mergers in your multi-site church consulting? And I said, I am. And he said, so are we at Leadership Network. God is doing something, and we ought to write a book about it. And so a couple years later, we published the book that Better Together, Making Church Mergers Work. Now, my journey with church mergers began when I was leading the multi-site strategy at Willow Creek in Chicago. And in 2003, I knocked on the door of a school on the North Shore of Chicago. And I was asking if I was inquiring about the possibility of renting that space so that we could launch a multi-site campus in this school. I was informed by the school that there was already a church meeting in the school, and so I said, well, here's my card. If anything changes, please call me. I got a call that week from that church. They were without a pastor, and they said, we understand that Willow Creek is looking to rent the space here. Could we sit down and talk with you about the possibility of sharing the facility together, was how they described it. I said, absolutely. So we met. And it became very apparent in our conversation that they weren't looking to just share the building, they wanted to join us. And like most pastors and church leaders, I had sort of a vague negative notion about church mergers not being really a good thing, and so I kind of tried to talk them out of this idea. I tried to say, look, we're not the only church, the best way, the only way to do church, but we have a very distinct way of doing church. It's not the typical way at Willow Creek. We're not looking to compromise or change that. I said, we like the way you do church. That's why we want to join you. And I said, well, we have some different viewpoints on things that aren't always in sync with the church world. He said, that's why we like Willow Creek. And so, we are very outward focused and evangelistic oriented, and we use the arts. That's why we want to be more like that. And so it became very apparent they were really serious about this. And so fast forward, we had about 150 people, Willow Creekers, that were living in the area that we were going to launch with. They had about 150 people in their congregation. We took the next few months to work through all that process, and then we launched together the Willow Creek North Shore campus in 2003. Fast forward to today, that campus now has outgrown that location and just opened up their brand new $34 million facility, 70,000 square feet facility with 3,000 plus people attending. And that was my first experience with church merger. So when we had that experience and I filed that away, that was a good experience. When we launched this as two merged congregations, and filed that away in the back of my mind. And then, as I mentioned, as I left Willow Creek to serve the church at large to multi-site, I found that in my consulting that more and more churches were being approached by churches could we join you? And so we wrote the book, Better Together, Making Church Mergers Work, because we saw there was something happening here, a different kind of merger. Now today I'd like to just share with you in the few moments we have that we discovered in this process that I wrote an article, or I had an interview with the Chicago Tribune a couple years ago and about church mergers, the number of ones that are happening in the Chicago area, that I've been involved with several of those. And I said, this was really an unintended consequence of the multi-site church movement. We didn't see this coming as we started thinking about multi-site, but it has become what we call an unintended consequence. And now, why is that? Now, this movement that began, really, my journey with multi-site church began as a senior pastor in Colorado Springs, as Dave mentioned. And by the way, Dave, everything I teach and share, I learned from Leadership Network. So I appreciate the good research and work that Leadership Network has done over the years in this movement. But when I started down this path in the 90s, this began, in the first wave of this movement, began with mega church pastors who found themselves out of room and out of space, and they were trying to solve, it was a Band-Aid solution to solve a space or zoning restriction. And so this is where it started, but very quickly evolved beyond being a Band-Aid strategy for mega churches to solve a space issue, and it became a growth strategy for healthy churches of all sizes. We know that the average church that goes multi-site is around 1,000 in attendance. Still not a small church, but not technically a mega church either, a big church. but has become a healthy growth strategy. Now, a third wave of this movement has become a revitalization strategy for stable but stuck churches that are not in trouble, not concerned or in trouble about going out of business, of not being able to survive, but like all churches that have been around for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, who are healthy, who are well-resourced, who have a lot of influence in the community. They're not going away. They're respected, but all churches that have been around that long and have survived and sustained are going to level off in their growth, not necessarily in their capacity to sustain, but in their growth. And so many of those kinds of churches around the country are discovering that we can leverage our reputation, we can leverage the resources in our church and our good influence in the community to extend our impact beyond the immediate walls of our parish through a multi-site model, and in the process re-energize and revitalize our home base. I just finished working last year with the largest United Methodist Church in Alabama, Fraser Methodist Church out of Montgomery, 50-year-old church, and they launched their first multi-site campus last year as a good example of that kind of, as a revitalization strategy for stable but stuck churches. Now, but here's where the mergers come in. The fourth wave of this movement is that this multi-site church movement has become what I call a rebirth or resurrection strategy for the struggling and declining churches across America. We know that there's 250,000 churches nationwide that are plateaued, dead, or dying by all the observers of church, observers. There's over 300,000 Protestant churches, about 320,000 Protestant churches nationwide, and 250,000 of them, 250,000, are in trouble. Now, many of those, not all of them, but many of those churches are discovering, we can go out of business, or we can struggle to survive and eventually go out of business either sooner or later, or we can choose our destiny and we could actually have a second chapter, a second life, or second birth, a new birth, by joining with a church that's flourishing, that's growing, that's multi-siting. We could join with them, we become a multi-site campus and have a rebirth of our church. And so there is a small but growing number of churches that are discovering we can do that. And that was what stimulated, we think, it's been an unintended consequence of the multi-site church movement. It's been catalyzed or stimulated by this option now. It's not two churches coming together in one location. That's the old mergers, which often was a failed strategy. But it's really two churches coming together and remaining in two locations, but embracing a shared vision for the future, not trying to hold on to a tired strategy of the past. And so we're seeing that this is growing, and I would predict, and I love the analogy that Dave gave earlier, that if you want to predict the future, don't try to predict the future, just look what's in the present and see where the seeds are. I predict that this merger trend will even outpace the multi-site trend, because there's about 5,000 to 8,000, different number, but around 8,000 multi-site churches nationwide, and every one of them is going to be interested and open to and even proactive about church mergers as a strategy, as part of their growing strategy. But a growing number, but that's only about 8,000. But there's 250,000 struggling, declining, plateaued, dead, or dying churches nationwide, and a growing number of them are discovering we can have a new life by joining with an existing growing church, multi-site church. Now, that's kind of an overview of why we are seeing this increase in mergers. Now, and by the way, in our first chapter of our book, we just try to really validate that this is a viable option that all kinds of churches, strong churches, struggling churches, strong and struggling churches, this is a viable option in the toolbox now. And more churches are using it. So now why is there an increase in church mergers? Two reasons. First of all, there is the value of church attendance, has shifted in our culture. Have you felt that shift? For the first couple of hundred years of our nation, up till about the end of the last century, as we moved into the 21st century, something shifted in the attitude towards church attendance in our culture. Up until the end of last century, there was this basic value in our culture that said church attendance is a good thing it's good to go to church. People should go to church. It didn't mean everybody went to church, but there was this cultural value that defaulted towards church attendance. That is gone or fading fast across our country. And it started to happen in feel it, I think, around the turn of this century. And this is why now that communities don't really want churches in their backyard. In the past, churches were always considered an asset to a community. I live in Colorado Springs. I love living in Colorado Springs. But the founder of our city was a man by the name of General Palmer. He was a Union general who, after the Civil War, he was a railroad guy. So he came out to Colorado and bought that whole city of Colorado Springs, the land. And he designed the city himself. And in this, it's a very well plot out, square and streets and all this. And on the four main corners of the downtown Colorado Springs, he said, that's where the Catholic Church will be, that's where the Baptist Church will be, that's where the Methodist Church will be, and that's where the Presbyterian Church will be. Why? Because a city is well served by having churches. Now, that's the way our culture operated and thought for a couple of hundred years or more. And that attitude, that value of church attendance, though, is fading fast and is gone in many parts of our country. Therefore, that local church is no longer seen as an asset, and actually churches take money off the tax roll, especially big churches. They create traffic jams, and they cause noise issues to the neighbors around that church. And so now we have this shift towards churches has gone from positive to negative. But not only has it shifted in the culture outside the church, church attendance is also, the value of church attendance has shifted in the church. Now, when I was leading my church, for the first 3 decades, or I was a pastor for 3 decades, 25 years. My last time as a pastor on a staff was at Willow Creek. I left in 2005 to go full-time consulting in church. But from 1980 to 2005, I was a pastor, associate pastor, senior pastor, etc. And during those years, especially in the years in the end of the last century, when we were reaching people and growing, the church is growing, and we would reach them, and they would commit to a local church, they would be in church every week, at least 3 out of 4 Sundays a month. Unless they were sick or traveling. That's how we used to go to church at the end of the last century. Today, those very same kind of people that we're reaching, now they're committing to the church, and they're coming to faith and committing to the local church and all that, but now instead of coming 3 out of 4 Sundays a month, they're coming 1 to 2 Sundays a month. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that, and we won't get into all that, but that's just the reality. Have you felt that? And so even if you're a healthy, growing church and you've done nothing to diminish your healthiness and all that, over the last 20 years, those same people who used to be there 3-4 times a month are now once or twice a month. Your attendance just cut in half, and you didn't do anything wrong. and assuming that was all, you staying healthy, etc. So what has that done? That has put that's putting a lot of churches out of business. Churches that are not, have been coasting on the default value of our culture towards church attendance, on the loyalty to a local church or to church or denomination, all that is gone. And so that has put a lot of churches in a very precarious place. And so many of them are now discovering, as we're discovering, that one option in the toolbox for those declining churches is to join through a merger. Now, that's why, but as we consult with churches now, in churches, I get a call every week now, me or my team, of some, 2 churches beginning this conversation. So why should a church merge? We talked about what's caused the environment for this, but what are when I get a call, and should we do this, Jim, or not? Churches approached us. Should we do this? And so when I sit down and talk with these 2 parties, usually the 2 senior pastors or a senior pastor and maybe a board member of the other church, we kind of talk about, here are the 4 questions that every church that's considering a merger should ask. First of all, should my church merge? Would my congregation, my individual congregation, be better by joining with this other church? Would my congregation be better off joining, be better together? The second question would be, could we accomplish more together than we could separately? Not only would my individual congregation be better off by joining this other one, But together, would we accomplish more of that synergy that's created by the two of us joining together? The third question would be, would our community be better served together? That is, by joining forces, could we do more for our community, not just for our two individual congregations? And then lastly, I think most importantly, could the kingdom of God be further extended by us joining together? And so not every time, a lot of churches might say, and I've said to some churches, I don't think you would be better by joining this other church or this other church joining you. But if you can answer yes to one or all of those, then it's a good indication that maybe we ought to seriously consider this. Now, when we wrote this book, we talked about different kinds of mergers, 4 different kinds of mergers. Not all mergers are the same. And we also have identified there's kind of a 3-step process that taking churches through this conversation. We always start here, first of all. Could we truly be better together on all these different areas? But we've also identified there are 25 distinct issues that every church merger has to address. Universally. 25 distinct issues. Now, most of those are benign issues, but they still have to have an answer. But usually there's 4 or 5 that are potential deal breakers. And if we can quickly identify what those 4 or 5 are, and it's not always the same for each church, but we start there and then address all the other issues. Now, should we merge or not? Here's some of the facts that we've learned. By the way, when we decided to write this book, we commissioned, Warren did with Leadership Network, commissioned the Barna Group to do a survey nationwide of churches of the last 20 years who had gone through a merger. And so a lot of that data is what we, based is in our book, and what we confirmed what we were seeing as well. But here's just a few fast, we have a bunch of learnings from that, but a few summaries is, first of all, we know that, as has already been mentioned, now there's over 40% of multi-site campuses have come through a merger or an acquisition of a church building. The second fact is every merger involves a lead church and a joining church. We described it like a dance. In a dance, you have a lead and you have a follow. You can't have 2 leads in a dance, or you're stepping on each other's toes. And so a merger conversation is like a dance. And there's always a lead, even when they're similar in health and size. One that leads, the other follows, or one leads, the other joins. So we really tried to establish that right up front with the church. Who's the lead church and who's the joining church? And it's always interesting. Sometimes the joining church thinks they're the lead church because they have the bigger building, but it's more of a liability than an asset. Or they've been around longer. Sometimes they may even have a bigger congregation, but they have peaked and are on the way down, where the smaller congregation is on the way up and more healthier. But anyway, lead and follow, lead and join. The majority of mergers in our survey are initiated by not the lead church, but the joining church. And that's still true. But as has been mentioned, we're beginning to see that to shift. Of maybe more and more churches lead churches are saying, how do we have this conversation, Jim, without being abrasive or coming off as hostile or as a takeover or arrogant? So that is happening. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And then another fact was that the majority of mergers involve a name change. Now that's another trend that's happened across the country. Regardless of mergers, a lot of churches are changing their names for one or two reasons. One, it's their name has, and it's usually their denominational name tag, has baggage in our culture today. Others is because of the multi-site church model has forced us to move away from having, it's hard to be First Baptist Church of Geneva, Illinois, which is I just did a merger with them in the next town. That's not Geneva. It's, so they just changed their name from Chapel Street Church. Chapel Street Church. And 3 locations now they have, and they're all about 10 minutes apart from each other, but they're so highly dense, communities. They're flourishing in these 3 locations, and they changed their name to Chapel Street instead of First Baptist Geneva for geographical reasons, but also to highlight their name is Chapel Street means small. Chapel has the idea of a small church or chapel, a worship place, and street. We want to have a chapel, a church on every street in our neighborhood. I love it. But we see a lot of name changing going on, and usually the name change in a merger is the joining church name is dropped, and they take on the leading church's name. But there often is the case where both churches say, we'd like to change our name too. And so many times they do a combination of the two or whatever, but we see a lot of name changing going on. And that's another trend that's obvious. And this is often, by the way, one of the 25 issues. What will be our new church name? And that's a very emotional issue for the joining church, to lose their name of 100 years or whatever. So, now those are a few facts. There's a bunch more in our book. But another thing to think about now is what's next. Where's this church merger trend going? As I mentioned already, I think this will outpace the multi-site movement. Both are growing dramatically, but I just think there's more churches that who are needing to consider merging, and there's a lot of multi-site churches, obviously, that would be loved to accommodate that possibility with them. But what's coming next on the horizon? Well, first of all, we'd say, I don't know how best to say this, but a proactive lead church mergers. Or maybe that's another way to say it is that there'll be lead church initiated mergers. Instead of the declining church that knocks on the door of a growing church that could we join you, more and more leading churches, growing churches, strong churches will start initiating that conversation. One of the mergers that my partner, Wade Burnett, just finished earlier this year was the merger of Crossroads Church in Kentucky, where Glenn Schneider was the senior pastor who was considering retiring, with the Crossroads Church over in Cincinnati, same name as it turned out, with Brian Tome, who was now, Crossroads over in Kentucky was a church with 4 campuses, about 5,000. It was not in trouble. It was not, going out of business. It wasn't in decline. It was solid financially, but the pastor was approaching retirement. He was a very good friend with Brian Tome across the river, who had a church of over 10,000 in 5 locations. And so Brian Tome, the lead pastor, in their 20-year friendship they'd have over these years, 2 separate independent churches with the same name, 2 different states, but next door to each other, really. The lead pastor said to the retiring pastor, what would you think about joining us as your retirement plan? We're so similar in so many ways already and all that. And, well, that idea took root, and we walked them through that merger process. And today now, Crossroads Church, Brian Tome is the senior pastor, is now a church of 20,000 in 10 locations. That was 2 mega churches merging together out of a shared vision for the future, et cetera, and similar philosophy. But it was initiated by the lead church. And I think we'll see more and more of that happening. I get that question all the time. Jim, how do we initiate this conversation in a productive, positive way that doesn't, get us off to a bad start? So we will see more and more of that. We also see more church plant mergers. As we talked about, this is an unintended consequence of the church merger movement, but it's also becoming a strategy for church planters. I just finished a merger last year in Tulsa, where 2 pastors, a church planter and a school down the street from a church that had been around for 30 years with a building. They were both Southern Baptist. They became good friends, like a Paul and Timothy relationship, and then the pastor wanted to retire, and so he said, you know what? You need a building. I need a successor. Why don't we merge? Well, they merged, changed their name together, and had a great success. Another thing would be succession mergers. We'll see more and more. That was a good example of the one I just shared in Tulsa. It was an opportunity to, through a merger, to acquire the future pastor, and then denominational-driven mergers. I'm working right now with a church in the Tampa Bay area, Methodist church, a very growing church, and the district superintendent and the bishop of that northern Florida district said, you want to multi-site around in our district, wherever you want to go, and we have declining churches, we'll work it out to give those to you. And we just did that. Now, my time has run out.